Hey guys, so at the end of each season, I have more tomatoes than I know what to do with. I give them away to friends and family, and I still end up throwing tomatoes away. So I'm going to show you a way to preserve tomatoes by simply using wood ash. There's a lot of very simple rules to follow, but if you don't follow them, it's not going to work as well. So you'll have fresh tomatoes well into the winter, depending on how long your winter lasts. If you have an extremely long winter, then you'll probably end up having to do some store purchasing of tomatoes. But if you have a short, relatively short winter, you can have tomatoes well into that winter that are still fresh and still quite good. So I want to give you some realistic expectations of this, because this is not a miracle method, but it does delay ripening, it will reduce surface moisture, and it will still allow just a little bit of ripening while they're in this state of preservation. This doesn't involve anything like canning or vacuum sealing or freezing or dehydration. So this method will keep the tomatoes in their natural state. But again, like I said earlier, there are some very basic rules you need to follow to preserve these tomatoes well into your winter. Now, some of the things you're going to need are very basic items. Some things like a cardboard box, any type of filter like this, because you're going to need to take some wood ash, and I usually have wood ash from my fire pit, but this has not been filtered yet, so you'll need to do that. You'll need to filter it. A couple of more important items is either Listerine or ordinary vinegar and some type of pot to put them in, and I'll explain that in just a second. So there's just a very simple process. The first thing we're going to need to do is we're going to need to deal with our wood ash, and I'll tell you a few things about that as well. Now, you can expect to extend your tomato life once you've picked it off the vine anywhere from 6 weeks up to 12 weeks. So you're talking about 3 months after your last harvest. And if you're harvesting up until October, you could last well into the winter time. But you're going to need to do this with just ordinary cardboard boxes. I would recommend that each time you do this with a cardboard box, if you're doing multiple boxes, kind of stagger it a little bit and put the date on each one. Don't do it all at one time, but just stagger it over a period of days or possibly weeks before you have your first frost, or until your tomato plants have stopped producing. So that way you'll know the oldest tomatoes that you put in the box, you need to consume those first, and then the last tomatoes you put in there right before you had your frost or before your tomato plants stop producing, you'll make sure that you're getting those oldest tomatoes eaten first or used first, and then that way you can have tomatoes probably until past New Year's very easily. Now, this works best with thin skin and low moisture tomatoes, and I'm going to put a list on the screen of about 4 or 5 varieties of tomatoes that I think it works best with. Now, these beefsteak tomatoes, they're not going to have that 12-week time there. They're going to be much less time, but I'm going to show you some tips on how to even make those last. So just remember, we're trying to get the right variety of the tomato. Also, you need the right type of environment. You need to keep it away from anywhere there's a lot of humidity. If you're going to bring it into your home, keep it away from kitchens where there might be a lot of humidity in the air from cooking, especially around bathrooms where you have daily bath times where steam may get to them. So probably the best optimal place is a garage, a basement. If you don't have one of those, even a crawl space will work, somewhere where it's staying very dry and cool, not cold, but just cool. Now, the variety of tomatoes that I found this does not work with are the cherry tomatoes, grape tomatoes, or thin-skinned heirlooms. The reason that is they tend to bruise a lot easier, and so they spoil much quicker. So I would recommend those varieties that you stay away from, and go with the ones that I'd listed earlier on screen. So I think you'll have a lot more success. There's nothing worse than doing an experiment like this and then it completely fails. So I'm just trying to give you information that where it didn't work for me in the past, stay away from those particular varieties. Now, there's one thing to remember, that when you're harvesting the tomatoes, you don't want to do this with fully ripe tomatoes. You want to get what's called the breaker stage, where you're just starting to see the tomato turn into a light pink or a very light red. So if it's fully ripe, don't try this, it won't work well. Now, if you try this with green tomatoes, you're going to have internal rot because it's not started that process, the internal biological process of ripening. So stay away from green tomatoes as well. You want to go back, as I said, to that breaker stage where you're just right. You're not too green and you're not too ripe. Now, I want to give you some harvesting rules and conditions that you need to follow when you're doing this method if you want the best possible results. Now, you want to make sure you do this when the plants are dry, there's no moisture on them, you haven't watered them, and there hasn't been rain within 24 hours there. And the best time to do this would be in the morning when the tomatoes are at their optimum time for harvesting and putting into our system here. Now, another thing you want to do is you just want to leave about 1 inch of stem on there. So cut it off, don't pluck it from the stem. But again, by leaving that stem there, you're going to help the preservation method that we're using as well. So just about 1 inch still of the green stem on there will help the tomato along its journey into natural preservation. So here's a step that a lot of people will skip in their processing of the tomatoes. They'll just put them directly into the ash. You need to make sure that you kill any possible mold or bacteria that might be growing on the tomato. So you can take either an ounce or 2 ounces of the Listerine or vinegar, put it in about a gallon of water, and then put your tomatoes in there. That's going to kill anything growing on the surface of the tomato. The next thing you want to do is you're going to remove these, put them in front of a very light breeze from a very small fan. You don't want a huge amount of air hitting them, but you want to make sure you dry them off, put them there, and do that for about 12 hours to make sure there's no moisture on the skin of your tomatoes. There's a very specific reason for putting them in front of the fan and making sure they're dry. You're going to seal microscopic pores in the skin of the tomato and make sure that the epidermal layer of your tomato is completely dry, so there's no moisture at all. So that's really an important thing that a lot of people skip, is that air drying and making sure the tomato is completely dry. A lot of times you can't really tell by wiping it down. You think you've got it completely dry, but can there just be this light layer of moisture on the skin that's not obviously. So just make sure you do that with a fan. It will definitely make a huge difference. I know it takes a little bit of extra time, but it really makes a difference in the long-term storage of these tomatoes. Now you'll be tempted to do just a regular wash, and if you don't use one of these two ingredients, then you're going to have a problem. You would be better off just not even washing it and then go to the next step directly into the ash. So remember, most people have these on hand in their house, or they can get access to them pretty easily. So just remember, don't do a standard wash, do a chemical wash with one of these two items here. Now I want to give you a quick glimpse of the ash I have here, and this was all done in my fire pit with limbs, branches from hardwoods, not from softwoods. The best type of hardwoods to use is oak, beech, things like that, things that you have mostly in the yard, but you want to avoid anything like pines or firs or anything like that. Absolutely don't use any type of treated or painted wood, because there can be chemicals in there and ultimately those can end up in your tomatoes. So just make sure that you are only using natural type of woods. Now I'll put a link in the description. If you don't have any type of fire pit or there's a burn ban in your neighborhood, you can do this with some ash that I'll put a link in the description. You may have to have 2 containers of it, but take a look in the description. You'll see some very good hardwood ash there. So it's really important that we do that. Next, I'm going to show you, once you've collected your ash out of your fire pit, and make sure you do this before it rains, because rain will leach the minerals out of your ash. So you want to make sure you do this. Once it's cooled, put it in a container like this, because you can still have 1 or 2 pieces of very hot coal in there. Give it about 24 to 48 hours to completely cool down, and I'll show you the next step you need to do with your ash. Now this is my really simple setup for taking the ash that I've collected from the fire pit. There are some pieces of charcoal in there. Usually I'll just take some screen like this, and sometimes I might double screen it with a finer mesh. So this mesh is pretty good, but it's still not as small as I'd like it to be, so I might use an even smaller mesh. I'll put a link to this mesh. It's pre-cut to this size in the description, but you just take your ash and scoop it onto your bucket and then just slowly sift it over time, and you'll eventually end up, your larger pieces of charcoal will be at the top. You can put that back into your fire pit and let it break down even further, but you'll have a much better ash that you're going to be using with your tomatoes. Now I wanted to let you see the end result of that screening process. It's not the finest of powder, but it's still fine. It's not, you know, super fine powder like baby powder, but this will work just fine. So we've removed the larger pieces of charcoal, and we'll just keep doing this process through the rest of that bucket, so we'll have some really fine ash from very safe hardwoods. And actually the best part of the hardwood to use is the smaller limbs. Sometimes the larger pieces of hardwood don't have as many minerals, so this is actually a lot more of the smaller limbs from those hardwoods. I want to let you see, this is some really fine powder there. It's really done quite well. It's done better than I thought it would. This particular batch must have burned completely up, but this is the size screen. As you can see, this is not like a window screen, so these are maybe about 2 to 3 millimeters each in diameter, and it did a great job on filtering our wood ash. So this is a key component to doing this, because having those large pieces of charcoal in there is going to be an issue. So make sure that you get a piece of screen like this, and you do some, once it's cooled down, of course, your ash, you need to make sure it's cool, because there could be a problem if you put it inside of a plastic bucket and you've got some hot coal still in there. So I'd say anywhere from 48 to 72 hours after your fire has quit. So guys, one of the reasons this works so well is this is a very alkaline substance, wood ash, and it has a pH, I believe, of between 10 and 12. It will keep the surface of the tomato very dry. It will keep insects away. Any microbes that might grow in there, it's just a habitat, or the ash around there will prevent it from thriving in that type of environment. So what would normally happen on your kitchen counter or in your greenhouse or wherever you're storing your tomatoes, you're going to have a lot of mold and a lot of bacteria growing on there, and the wood ash discourages that from happening. So I'll talk about a few more things that the wood ash will do. It will absorb any ambient moisture or humidity that's in the air around the box. If you've ever bought any type of perishable item, you'll see all those little small packets in there that absorb moisture. Well, that's kind of essentially what this is doing. In addition to the pH level, we're talking about absorbing moisture. Another thing it'll do, it'll reduce any possible odors that might end up in the tomatoes. You can sometimes put tomatoes adjacent to something else and it can kind of absorb that odor. Another thing it's going to do is going to deter, if I can say that properly, it's going to deter any insects from making it to your tomatoes because of the wood ash. So there's a lot of different reasons we're using wood ash to preserve these. And even refrigeration, you're not going to have the length of time in refrigeration. You're going to have spoilage in refrigeration. Probably the only way you could get super long-term storage is freezing or dehydrating, and sometimes, well, obviously freezing is going to alter the taste of it, and dehydrating, sometimes a dehydrated tomato can taste pretty good, but it's definitely not going to taste like a fresh tomato. Now, the type of box you're putting these in are just going to be your standard non-painted, no special decor or anything on the outside of the box. You just want a standard cardboard box. I prefer these boxes that are just slightly larger than my largest tomatoes. I don't like to double stack these. Some people will say you could do multiple layers, but I think there's a chance of bruising when you have a lot of weight on the tomato. So I like just doing one layer at a time and putting one box on a shelf. Also, you want to make sure that there's no special coating inside the box or anything like that. Not too common, but sometimes that does happen, so just give you a heads up on that. Also, if your box is not taped like this one is at the bottom, you can line this with paper towels or craft paper, not wax paper, because you want to keep as much moisture from collecting inside the box. So just make sure, if you don't want ash all over the place and it's not properly sealed, you could also use painter's tape for that. But if you don't have either of those, just make sure that you use some craft paper or just some common paper towels to prevent any ash from spilling out. Now I wanted to show you what I've done here on this area where some of the air can escape. You don't want to tape this shut. You want to have airflow. I've taken this little paddle bit with a very sharp point. You can do it with a nail, a knife, anything, but we've put some holes in the top of it, and the more the better, because we want airflow out of the top of this box. We want moisture to escape. So just remember, whatever type of cardboard box you're using, make sure that it can breathe, because that's one of the keys. These tomatoes have a lot of moisture in them. Now, these I'm just using for demonstration purposes because they're really overripe and they're beefsteak. So normally I'm collecting these from the garden. I'm going to be collecting tomatoes that are not near this ripe. They're just started to break into a little bit of a light pink or a very light red. Now in the box I've put in about 2 to 3 layers of paper towels. That's going to also help any moisture from every tomato we have in there. And we're going to put about 1/2 inch layer, try not to make too big of a mess here, but a 1/2 inch layer under the tomatoes. So even before we start putting the tomatoes in the box, we want a good 1/2 inch to 1 inch layer of our ash, and just put that all the way around the edges of the box. And you can kind of shake the box to allow it to level out once you've got it in there. And there we go. I think we've got about a 1/2 inch there. And then I'll show you how to place the tomatoes. So that's really what a critical thing to do, is you need to have a layer of ash under the tomatoes, and then we're going to put the tomatoes in there. But there's also another rule of putting your tomatoes in. Make sure that you don't pack them in there, and it's good if your stems are still on there. You can have it about a 1/2 inch, maybe a little bit higher. Maybe your box needs to be a little bit deeper. But make sure that your tomatoes do not touch. As I'm putting them in the box, I have a minimum of about 1/2 inch in between each tomato. So that's really critical. I may need to move these over so I can get it 3 rows in there. But touching the sides of the box is perfectly fine. But in between each tomato, make sure that they do not touch. As you can see, we're barely able to fit 9 tomatoes in here. But if we're storing these properly in the proper environment, these 9 tomatoes, like I said, can last anywhere up to 12 weeks. Now we're going to come back in with our ash, and we're going to actually cover the ash. Now a lot of people are going to ask, won't the tomatoes absorb the ash? No, they will not. it will not harm the tomato in any way or change the taste. So we're just going to go in there and put in lots of scoops of our ash all around the tomatoes, and make sure that you don't pack it in there. You want it to be very lightly put in there. If you close your top and it's putting a lot of pressure there, just leave it slightly open, because you don't want to put pressure on these tomatoes, which could cause bruising. Now, I'm not going to force this box closed. I might tape it and leave it slightly elevated like that, just to allow any moisture buildup to escape there. We don't want to force these in here. Some of the other things to remember is you want to make sure these are stored at a temperature of anywhere from 45 to 60 degrees, low humidity, and also complete darkness is preferred. So a crawl space would be optimal up under a house, a garage, inside of a container in the garage that can still be allowed to breathe. You want to make sure that you don't cut off the airflow. So the ideal places are root cellars, basement shelves, cool pantries where it stays nice and dark, and unheated interior closets. If you only have a small closet in your house that's not often used, you can use that to store your tomatoes in over a long period of time. Now, there's a weekly inspection protocol you can do. You can slightly open the box and uncover one of the tomatoes and check for softness. If it's overly soft, it may have started to rot inside of the box, and remove that particular tomato and replace it with more ash in that spot to absorb any moisture that might have leaked out of the tomato. Also, you want to smell for any kind of unusual odors or any foul odors. It could mean that the tomatoes were too ripe and they've started to rot. And so just remember to do that weekly inspection to make sure there's nothing unusual. Maybe a wet spot on the box could mean that it's failed and the tomatoes were too ripe. So you kind of have a balancing act when you put these in there. These were obviously for demonstration purposes only. They were far too ripe. So I would recommend a very light red or a light pink for complete success doing this. So I think these will probably be removed. I just wanted to show you the process. We're in the middle of winter, and I wanted to show you for next summer what you should plan on doing with your excess amount of tomatoes. Now, realistically, we're talking anywhere from 30 to 60 days on tomatoes, and sometimes certain varieties can last up to 90 days, but that can make a huge difference, because sitting on the counter, my tomatoes don't last hardly any time at all. Even in the fridge, that doesn't extend it out beyond 30 days. So just depending on what type of variety you have, it's also going to depend on the lifespan inside of one of these containers. So you might have some that make it to 90 days and still seem pretty fresh. Now, one thing to remember to do is don't eat the ash. When you remove this out of here, make sure you give it a good wash before consuming. And if they're really thick-skinned varieties, you can even remove the skin from the tomato itself. So guys, I probably have in excess of 400 to 500 tomatoes in one season, and it's just no way I can store them in a fridge. No way I'm going to try to freeze all that number as well. So doing this little method and storing them away in my garage is a great way to have fresh tomatoes even into December, and hopefully sometimes even into January. So guys, if you like this video, I hope you'll give it a thumbs up. If you found something interesting, I hope you'll subscribe. We cover everything about gardening, greenhouse, alternative heating methods. So I have a lot of different variety of subjects. I believe I have over 300 videos now on the channel. So I hope you'll take a look at those, and you might find something interesting as well as gardening. Guys, I really appreciate you watching, and also forgot to mention, have a Patreon if you really want to support the channel. So have a great day.